by the Oxford Psychedelic Society. This is the second in-person talk we've held since the start of the pandemic. We're very lucky today to be joined by two incredible speakers, Michael Ferguson and David Yaden, who are both actually flying in from abroad for this event. Yes. David is with the University of Pennsylvania. Michael is with the Harvard Medical School / Harvard Divinity School. And the event's going to be moderated tonight by Sam Cherry, our science officer. And we'll also be going out to the King's Arms after this, so you can continue the conversation with the speakers. Before we begin the event, I'll just note that all of our events we try to put on for free. So if you consider donating to our PayPal, that's at oxpsysoc, OXPSYSOC. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. It's going to be a pretty free, moderated debate. Both the speakers have prepared some opening remarks and some audience questions. So with that, I will let Dr. Ferguson take it away. All right.
Esteemed hosts, guests of this debate, and my formidable interlocutor, Dr. Yaden, thank you all for your respective contributions to this. All right, thank you all for your respective contributions to organizing and participating in this exciting event centered on highly animating questions. We've assembled to discuss a two-part query. First, can psychedelics be used to advance our understanding of spirituality? During our time together this evening, it is my happy task to represent the following response. Yes, of course. Of course psychedelics can be used to advance our understanding of spirituality, and of course psychedelics can be used to advance someone's personal development along the spiritual path. In my home institution at Harvard University, I'm fortunate to instruct an undergraduate course on the cognitive neuroscience of meditation. Given that the majority of Harvard students enrolled in the course seem to have at least some curiosity in matters related to the spiritual life, I asked them for their opinion on these questions that we're addressing here this evening. A bit to my surprise, and much to my delight, when asked whether they think psychedelics can be used to advance our understanding of spirituality, no less than a full 100% of these phenomenally capable students responded in the affirmative. Yes, they unanimously opined, psychedelics can indeed be used to advance our understanding of spirituality. At this point, I began to feel a tinge of pity for anyone assuming a position contrary to that which I represent here. And given that I am a man by nature who is susceptible to the persuasion of pitiful emotion, I will also graciously give partial representation throughout my comments to two additional answers. No, and maybe. Starting then with my first position, which I think is the overwhelmingly truest and clearest position, yes, of course psychedelics can advance our understanding of spirituality. A major crux in both understanding this question well and responding to it in a satisfactory manner is to create a shared agreement on what we mean exactly by the word spirituality as a term of art. Your own Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology, A Search for the Sacred. This definition for the word spirituality resonates deeply with me for several reasons, including both the concision and the flexibility of this definition. Conceptualizing spirituality as a search concisely characterizes it as an active quest, a process of personal discovery and development, sacred. But lest we slip into an infinite regress of terms and definitions, let us here and for now accept the idea of the sacred to generously embrace wide possibilities that are variably non-theistic or theistic, essential or constructed, and fundamental or emergent. Indeed, in his book, Sacred Knowledge, Johns Hopkins psychologist William Richards catalogs recurring themes wherein psychedelic experiences include God, immortality, interconnectedness, love, beauty, and wisdom, themes which constitute the very heart of sacred reverence and wonder across the diversity of human thought. Our present cultural moment is one in which the scientific gaze of medicine is renewing and expanding its examination of substances whose uses can be traced to the earliest documented stages of human history. We are recognizing the potency of these agents for unlocking and vivifying sacred archetypal and intuitive concepts that span human longings for deities, immortality, and wisdom. We are observing liberation assisted by psychedelic interventions from clutches of addiction and mental illness. And we are witnessing inward transformations from self-hate to self-love. Taken together, we can resoundingly affirm that psychedelics can and will be used to advance our collective understanding of human spirituality. Thank you.
And science needs to measure things and to have falsifiable claims. I would say, I'll leave some additional things to closing, but I will say, out of psychedelic research, there's so many interesting questions to study, psychologically, neuroscientifically, about the human experience in general. I don't think we should be distracted by a false hope that something about psychedelic research will explain life, the universe, and everything. So with that, over to the moderator.
So I think the real challenge against your position is whether you think that psychedelics do open up this new realm of sort of epistemic possibility in science, so they do allow us to go into things that typically we can't experience or we can't measure. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, it seems pretty apparent that psychedelics do give us a whole range of phenomena, almost on demand, that are rarefied, and that because they're so rarefied, that people identify as mystical in nature because they defy easy explanations with typical use language. And so I think that the answer to that direct question is yes. And at the same time, I would say that we should be careful not to turn our Baileys into straw men, in the sense that even within the bounds of naturalism or of natural compatibilism, that there are some pretty bold claims that I'm willing to make and stand behind with regard to the nature of sacrality or sacredness. And even more so with the ways in which psychedelics allow us to interface and experience sacrality and sacredness. I would also say that, to Dr. Yaden's point about typical understandings of spirituality involving some kind of supernatural dimension, or some kind of a supernatural character to them, that if we look closely at religious traditions, and I'll freely acknowledge that my background expertise is more anchored in monotheistic Western religions, although I do have some experience and training in Eastern thought, that non-dual understandings are actually coursing through the veins of these religious dogmatic structures. So much so that I think that we live in a very strange moment wherein the things that people suppose to be the orthodox religious planks are actually not at all reflective of what we could call orthodox religious concepts. Just one anchor point in this would be scholastic treatments of Aristotelian concepts of the human soul, which are really grounded in what's termed hylomorphism, hyle being the term for matter, morphe being for form, and the idea that in order to access sacredness, divinity, we don't need to break away from the physical realm. Rather, we need to recognize the infusion of sacredness and of divinity that is the form of the material world that we inhabit. That in and of itself can be very compatible with naturalistic means of investigation and inquiry, with physical science methods of exploration. And I do see psychedelics as creating a bridge between high theology even and scientific inquiry and physicalism.
So let's dig into the word sacred a bit. So as spirituality as a search for the sacred, that was the definition that he gave. I don't know how common that definition is. Like I said, I think that the more common usage is something about a non-physical mind that goes beyond the body, or a non-physical mind goes beyond the physical universe. And so I do want to push you on that, and I don't think the word sacred gets you anywhere. I think it's just another term, and I don't think it's not an infinite regress to say, okay, you've said spirituality is sacred, now what is sacred? And so I think it would be useful to get on the same page about sacredness, specifically as to how it involves supernatural kinds of claims, because I think that we will mostly agree about what we can study about spirituality, because we do it all the time, right? I mean, both of us have published multiple papers on human spirituality, and so it's the supernatural sense of spirituality that I'm interested if we can get on the same page with at least the terms for the debate, and then we can see where we still disagree. That's my proposal, at least, up to the moderator.
I'm happy with that. So.
Well, I am not happy with spirituality being confined to supernaturalism only, for a lot of different reasons. One, because I don't think that reflects growing dynamics in the way that people are using these terms. As you're familiar with, as many of you may know, within the United States, there is a growing movement of people identifying as spiritual but not religious. And there is a growing movement within, the ranks of secular institutions and secular thought to acknowledge that there's something expansive that isn't fully captured by a reductive or an eliminative materialism. And it does seem that spirituality is the default term that people reach for when they're describing that. I am very willing to talk about the separate question of whether psychedelics and psychedelic science may have some utility for exploring the divine, the transcendent, the supernatural. We can definitely have those conversations. But I'm leery to collapse the entirety of the conversation into that niche topic.
I think that we need to go there. Right? Because this whole debate really does turn on that issue, because otherwise we just agree. Right? Because we both study human spirituality. And I use psychedelics, you'll be using psychedelics to study spirituality. And so it's just trivially true that we study, say we do a randomized clinical trial, and at the end of it, we look at the psilocybin arm and we say, have you become more spiritual, for example? Have your beliefs changed? Did your experience feel spiritual? What do you mean by that? We do that all the time. And so I don't think that it's already, I think everyone here, well, let me just see, show of hands. Would everyone agree that we already do that all the time and that's not particularly interesting to talk about? Yeah, just raise your hand if you agree. It's definitely interesting to talk about. All right, scratch the second part, because I hope we do talk about it. Does everyone agree we already do that as a matter of course in science? So raise your hand if we just already are measuring that. Okay, well then read my papers, because I mean, really, like Google my name and like spiritual beliefs, and you'll immediately see that we already do science on people's ascriptions or attributions of spirituality. We do that all the time. I don't think that that's interesting, because psychedelics can and do tell us about spirituality in that sense of the term. So maybe I should just concede the debate. We can all go to the pub. But I don't think that that's the most interesting part of what we could be talking about. I don't think it's the intention of this debate. I'm looking at the moderator.
Yeah, we're more interested in the hard question, so to speak.
Okay, so you heard it from the moderator himself. Okay, so in that case then, I do think we need to push on this issue a little bit and say, what do you mean by spirituality? And if you mean a search for the sacred, then what do you mean by the sacred? And I don't think, don't use just another one word. But if you mean something like mind, a non-physical mind of some kind, the notion that something about our minds can survive bodily death, or that beyond the physical reality is some kind of greater mind. If you don't mean those things, we should get clear about that. But if you do agree with that would be a really interesting thing to discuss, I think.
Sure. So, violating your instructions to not just use another word to point beyond the term sacred, I think that maybe we can inch towards some kind of a productive conversation here by at least exploring what is meant by the divine or by divinity or by the sublime, if you will. By way of analogy, if we're talking about something like art, and we're having a debate about whether art can direct us toward beauty. All right, again, on a certain level, that could be trivial. To be like, well, almost by definition, there is this historical relationship with art and with beauty. And so now let's talk about whether there really are muses. And if these disembodied muses came down and whispered artistic inspiration into the artist himself, I'd be, well, we've done a little bit of a pivot away from what might be the most productive point of conversation, which is about the nature of beauty, why it exists in the phenomenology of a species that evolved, that is anchored and mired in matter and in biology. And so similarly, with something like divinity, human responses to the sublime, David, I think that there are rich questions there that aren't trivial in the way that perhaps there's an impulse to characterize them as such. And again, I'm very happy to talk about implications of supernaturality. And yet, these basic questions about how it is that sacralization or the assignment of sacred value comes to be. What are the effects of the assignment of sacred value on an individual's life? How then does an individual begin to embody principles that they identify as divine or sanctifying? That those are very meaningful questions that even will have clinical and therapeutic implications to them as we lean deeper into them. I would say that another point of maybe obvious agreement that we could put on the table, but that I don't see as obviously an agreement point in the broader conversation about psychedelics, is whether or not we should be satisfied by a neurobiological model of psychedelics alone, wherein we are satisfied to subtract out subjective effects or subtract out experience and only be thinking about psychedelics in terms of molecular mechanisms or physical exchanges at the neurobiological level. I think that in that sense, if we're going to create a circular prison, even, if you will, for what it is that science can do and ought to do and can discuss and can conclude, well then we can't do anything about spirituality. And so in that sense, if we're in agreement that a neurobiological approach to psychedelics is insufficient for the totality of what it is that we're looking at with psychedelic inquiry, I'd be interested to establish that as a common point.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I don't want to give you all the fun questions to look at as a neuroscientist. So yes, psychological, social dynamics for sure matter. I'm not going to let you get away with saying spirituality, sacredness, divinity.
Sure.
So let's just, and then we can move on to the stuff that we agree about.
Yeah.
That'll probably be more fun. But I do think maybe you should just concede this point to me, and then we can talk about what we agree about. But so imagine this. Imagine, like those old operating theaters back in old school medicine. Imagine we're doing that. So you're all in the audience here looking at a participant here, they can't see you hopefully, that would be scary for them, but a participant in a psychedelic study who's just taken a large dose of psilocybin, okay? That's really interesting. I've watched like many dozens and hundreds of hours of people taking psilocybin. It's really interesting. We can talk about that later maybe. But imagine this person who's just taken a lot of psilocybin maybe an hour ago. They say, I see an angel, and the angel is floating on your head, or they're standing on your head, okay? And I say, wow, that's really interesting. So as a scientist, I think, let's try to measure this, right? I mean, let's use all of our equipment, try to measure it. Nothing comes up. You know, we don't see anything in the room. They're saying, no, there's really an angel standing on your head. And we say, well, we've tried everything. We can't measure it. And then the person says, well, it's beyond the physical. You're not going to be able to measure it. You know, it's spiritual, right? That's interesting. That's a really interesting thing to study still from the psychological, from the neurobiological perspective. However, nothing about psychedelic science is going to tell us whether or not there was really an angel standing on my head. And so if we mean psychedelic science will advance understanding of spiritual understandings, if we mean that kind of thing, then would you concede that psychedelic science will not, in fact, advance spiritual understanding of that sort?
For fun and truth, I'll say no, I don't concede that. And this is perhaps where I'll represent the maybe position.
Okay.
And, you know, indulge me to use an analogy that you've heard me share before. But I think that if you were to have said, you know, a few hundred years ago, that by careful observation of rare species in the Galapagos Islands, we can make some kind of inference about the origin of biological life, that would have sounded absurd. It's not always obvious a priori what types of theories and hypotheses we'll be able to generate with vast and careful observation. And so to build on this example, this toy model, let's just say hypothetically that you were now to conduct this same experiment with thousands of people. And all of these thousands of people were to give you the same phenomenal account. There's an angel standing on your head. It even has a name. It even has a certain number of wings. It even has a certain set of features that it's routinely carrying. Well, that could give us a place to start changing variables into seeing what happens. Okay, well, what if we do the same thing in a satanic temple? Do they see the same angel on your head? And you do this with thousands of people, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe now it has horns instead of a halo. I mean, we're being a little bit playful, but to drive to a point. And that point for me is that we don't know what we'll be able to hypothesize and theorize until we gather vast amounts of data and observe the data with radical humility. And I've got to emphasize that, radical humility. This is one of the ways where I think that we can get really tripped up by assuming that we already know what the answers are, and so we're just running these experiments as an exercise in spending funding dollars, as an exercise in feeling like we're important as scientists. Entering into these experiments with humility is going to be one of the most difficult things for contemporary scientists to do. And yet, when you think about our origins as a species and the fact that our sensory perceptions did not evolve for the purpose of having direct access to the ultimate and the big questions of things, why shouldn't we be radically humble as we're now trying to get some kind of an insight into things that are squarely beyond the selection pressures for the evolution of our physical senses? So again, all that to say, like, maybe actually, you know, I'll wrap up this little soapbox moment with a reference to Occam's razor. That yes, what Occam's razor dictates that in light of all of the evidence, the simplest explanation is most likely the one to be true. But we can't swing that razor if we haven't looked at all of the evidence. And we simply haven't. Again, so much of the discourse on psychedelic science is whether or not to even engage phenomenal experiential accounts, or whether those are just epiphenomenal and we really need to create new designer drugs that don't have these quote-unquote side effects of subjective experience. So let's run the trials. Let's gather extensive amounts of data. Let's compare it to mystical literature. Let's deploy historical methods, anthropological methods, experimental clinical methods, and then again, keep a very radically open mind to what types of hypotheses and theories might emerge from that vast data collection and data observation.
Well, I totally agree with everything that you just
All right.
said. But I think you've missed the debate entirely. I think everything that you just said, I totally agree with. Yeah, we don't know where psychedelic science is going to lead, right? And radical humility, epistemic humility, really important. On a side note, if we can't figure out why psilocybin is effective in depression, I'm a little bit wondering if we need to go to solving the life, the universe, and everything. It feels like maybe that's not in keeping with radical humility. But in terms of what you're saying about being open to the data, absolutely, yeah, I completely agree with that. This is a fascinating new scientific topic. It's a really interesting scientific field. That's why I'm a psychedelic researcher. I'm absolutely fascinated by these experiences, and they're extraordinarily profound. And I think that they will advance our understanding of mental processes, neurobiological processes, how people get a sense of meaning and purpose in life, the way that they make spiritual and religious attributions. That's a whole lot of really interesting things I just said. That's like hundreds of people's entire careers. That's decades and decades of scientific work. Careful, humble, totally agree, scientific work will be required and very open. However, in terms of being able to advance an understanding of whether or not the angel is on the head, I don't think we have any traction. And I don't think we have any traction scientifically, and I don't think psychedelics are going to help us at all. There's a concept called psychedelic exceptionalism, which is this idea that the normal rules don't apply to psychedelics because they seem so interesting and fascinating. But I think basically we're still operating in a scientific framework. We're still not going to be able to confirm or deny whether the angel is on the head. And so when you're ready to concede that point, then we can continue and talk about all the scientific research we can do.
Okay. If you'll allow me to weigh in just very briefly, maybe it would be useful for you to outline, if you're not willing to accept a kind of scientific approach to those questions, what sort of epistemic approach you would find satisfying for these sorts of questions. And then maybe we might see where there's some agreement or difference.
Sure. So the angel on the head kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this person, call her Mary, lying on the bed, you're all watching her have a psilocybin session. She says, I see an angel on your head. And we do all of the instrumentation that we have available to us, Oxford, Harvard, Hopkins, we can't confirm nor deny. And so we get to this point, which is, okay, what now? So science can't weigh in, right? Which is the first question of the debate. So science can't weigh in. What do we do? Well, Mary has a choice, right? And just the way that I described William James's professional conclusion and his personal conclusion, I think Mary could say, okay, you scientists can't tell me one way or another whether there's an angel that's really there. She might say, for me, I see it. And true, it might just be originating entirely from my nervous system. I might be having a vision, or a hallucination. She might say that. She might consider it. She might say, no, this feels really real. It fits with other beliefs that I have. It's deeply meaningful, and even though these scientists can't provide me with certainty, they can't confirm nor deny. For me personally, I choose yes. Right? Mary may make the leap of faith. And so I think ultimately these questions, we can't offboard them to the scientists to sort out for us. We each and every one of us needs to make these decisions for ourselves.
Well said. I'll give a partial concession here, which is that I certainly don't think that science alone is going to be able to give us the answers to these questions. I mean, let's go ahead and complexify the situation a little bit and recognize that even within mystical literature, inside of formal religious structures, there is still another set of questions that opens up. So let's, just for funsies, say that somehow, in a very, very clever way, scientists were able to come to some type of conclusion that Mary really is seeing something on your head that is unusual to our physical perceptions and that she identifies as an angel. Then religion comes in with its history of spiritual discernment and says, but how do we know that it's not actually an angel of the devil? How do we know that it's actually an angel of God? That simply acknowledging some kind of a metaphysical conclusion doesn't actually take us to the final payoff of what would interest that individual, presumably. And so here I will turn to some of the historical mystics, like John of the Cross being one of them, who's revered as the so-called mystical doctor. And one of the things that is a common theme, not just in John, but across spiritual and mystical writers, is this theme of discernment. And particularly the ways in which you have to look at the character fruits, you have to look at the way that the individual is transformed in order to make some kind of assessment on the event that happened. And so, again, to recapitulate my partial concession, I don't think that it's possible for us to offload all of this labor onto scientific methods, meaning physical sciences or natural sciences. That there has to be an integration of careful, systematic, subjective first-person engagement, in addition to any insights that perhaps we might one day be able to make using physical scientific methods. In that sense, then, I think that this is a nice pivot into the second question about whether psychedelics can be used to advance someone's personal development along the spiritual path. And that question of personal development along the spiritual path may or may not have anything to do with some of these metaphysical types of questions, but rather with the way in which virtue develops in the individual and then plays out. And then that set of questions about what is virtue, how do we define it, and how do we identify when an individual has grown in virtue or in a spiritual character following a psychedelic session or a series of psychedelic interventions, is one I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts about. Number one, whether it's even appropriate for us to think in those terms of spiritual development.
Yeah, so good idea. Let's turn to that second question. Unfortunately, I'm going to be really annoying here and just say it still depends what you mean by spiritual. And if you mean, can we understand something about someone's spiritual development in a supernatural sense? In other words, can we see the ledger in heaven related to an individual? I think the answer has to be no. But I appreciate that partial concession. But let's talk about maybe what's more interesting is something about the folk sense of spiritual development. I think this has to do with feelings of gratitude, of empathy and compassion towards other people, and acts of service, and a kind of joyfulness and playfulness, and a deep devotional love. Right? These are the kinds of things I think we mean by someone growing in their spirituality. And again, not only can we study those things scientifically, we already are. And so you can look up studies from our group at Johns Hopkins, like the psilocybin trials, and we look at these persisting positive effects, and we see that 2 months later, even 18 months later, amazingly, we see increases in attitudes, positive attitudes towards oneself and other people, altruistic positive social effects, positive mood, increases in the felt sense of meaning. These are really profound and amazing findings. In the introduction, I mentioned I was at the University of Pennsylvania. That's where I did my doctoral work. And there I was interested in how you could get these kinds of effects from interventions. And a lot of psychological interventions are really subtle, and the effects are really brief. What's absolutely extraordinary about psychedelics is that the effects are large and that they're enduring. I find that absolutely amazing. And it looks like psilocybin is the most positive, potent positive intervention so far discovered. So in terms of, can psychedelic research advance our understanding of someone's spiritual development? I think if you mean the kinds of things like I listed, these psychological qualities, then the answer is absolutely yes, and that's amazing. If you mean the supernatural side of things, then I have to say we can't know, and so no.
Would you like to respond or do you have questions?
We can do questions.
So we're going to go to questions now. We'll start over there. Get this one working.
Oh, wow. Hey, thanks for this. I'm going to make a point, which is loosely related, and then pose a question. So the first point around sort of scientific technology to capture kind of the movement over from the material to the immaterial. An experience I've had lately is I'm a long COVID patient, and when I had my chest x-rayed, nothing wrong, but I'm still breathless. When I had a CT scan done, nothing wrong, I'm still breathless. And so because of that, our methods of inquiry made me feel like I'm crazy, something's wrong with me. It wasn't until I did a study in Oxford with this very high diffusion MRI technique where they went, oh God, you're buggered, mate, because they had the right tool to get to the level of intricacy. And I just wonder how much of this debate, in terms of reconciling science with the supernatural, spiritual, sacred, whatever you want to call it, whatever S word, that comes into play. And I just thought that was a nice little analog to what you were talking about. And then my question is, I suppose, I often worry about how much psychedelics could just be a proxy for spiritualism, in the same way that, say, sex is a proxy for connection and love. And the only problem is we can be very clear about the fact that those two things are very different. Sex and love are different. The trouble with spirituality is there's no real purist spirituality because it's so ill-defined. Then you can't really say for certain if one thing is tokenism of the other. So you can't really tell for sure if it's progress or maybe a shortcut to a detour instead. I just wonder if you could say for sure whether you think it's a step forward or maybe a facsimile.
So really great point and really fantastic question. Thank you very much for that. On a very general note, I'll say that breaking supernatural and natural into entirely distinct magisteria is, at this point probably clearly something that I'm just not comfortable doing. Short of coming up with new technologies, which perhaps we may, which will give us interesting insights into physicality. For goodness sake, there's a big punt in physics to say that 85% of the matter and energy of the known universe is dark matter and dark energy, which is just code for saying, we don't really know how to interact with it yet. And so I, optimistically hold out the possibility that we will continue to derive and create technologies that can detect and observe interesting physical phenomena that we're just not detecting and observing right now. But that's not, for me, that's not the final answer. I do think that each of us really would serve our shared humanity by looking deeply in our respective wisdom traditions. That each of our respective wisdom traditions that have some kind of a systematic spirituality associated with them have given us keys, again, that are typically called discernment. I think about in, Paul's writings to the Galatians, he talks about fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering. And he says, here are the types of behaviors and the types of attitudes that if you're having those, then according to this spiritual epistemology, you can feel confident that this is like authentic divinity as opposed to some kind of a constructed or tokenized representation of divinity. Within a Buddhist perspective, particularly the Way of the Bodhisattva is a text that I've got a lot of affection for. It talks about, again, this threefold set of virtues of humility, detachment, unconditional love, universal love, and that if you're growing in those attributes, yes, you're having authentic spiritual growth. The ways in which we can differentiate psychedelic substitution for quote-unquote authentic spiritual growth, I think might come down to the frequency of dependence of use. Is it a situation where now in order to feel this bump in my humility, detachment, universal love, that I need to keep relying on a substance on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis? Okay, maybe that still is a training wheels situation rather than a full-on riding off into the sunset with a degree of spiritual skill and autonomy. And so I think that dependence and frequency of use might be one of the ways that we can start to tease out a quote-unquote authentic spiritual arc of development, if there is even such a thing, which I think that there is.
Yeah, it's a great topic, great question. Yeah, I think we're in the midst of a psychedelic hype bubble, and there's a whole lot of statements coming out like psychedelics will change the world, they'll transform you for the better forever. Those are not the case. That's too much to ask for. And so if someone is taking a psychedelic hoping to become saint-like or bodhisattva-like, despite what your friends who went to Burning Man tell you, that's just seems so unlikely to me. We can be nuanced about this. We can say, yeah, it looks like the data from psychedelic research is really strong and compelling and provides these really robust psychological benefits. But that doesn't mean that you can stop doing all of the other things that we know about to develop ourselves and become moral people and thriving and having good relationships. And so, yeah, I would definitely be frightened if someone thought that psychedelics were the only way for spiritual development.
I think we'll take the next question. Pedro.
Hi. As you were speaking, what came to mind is a figure who I think is extremely important in this discussion, which is Aldous Huxley. And what I found really interesting is that Huxley, before his notable writings in the Doors of Perception on mescaline, wrote a book of theology called The Perennial Philosophy, which I'm sure you know about. And what he describes there is what he perceived to be commonalities between mystical traditions, notably St. John of the Cross, as you mentioned earlier, Meister Eckhart, Sufi mystics, and so on and so forth. And some of these commonalities will sort of relate to the accessing of some kind of knowledge or experience that we can talk about in terms of the Godhead, or even in a more modern terminology, an access to a sort of panpsychist or panentheist dimension. And I was wondering whether you believe psychedelics to be a similar way of accessing these things, as the mystical traditions of Neoplatonist early Christians, or Sufists, or Kabbalists, or some of the other mystical traditions. And also he wrote this book in this very college, or partly.
Yeah, so I love that book. It's great. So Aldous Huxley was a perennialist. So he believed that pretty much all people everywhere in all of these traditions are having basically the same experience. There's a contrary scholarly tradition called the Contextualists or the Constructivists. And what they say is, basically, if you look at the actual descriptions of these experiences across time, across geographical region, across cultures, across religions, there's actually quite a lot of differences as well. And so I think what Huxley was advancing was a particularly naive form of perennialism, which is to say, basically all these experiences are the same. And I think that's been more or less refuted at this point. I think this is a ripe area for interdisciplinary study, and I've been convinced by my colleagues who are historians and who are scholars of religion that there's just too many differences in these reports across traditions. And so I think Huxley, there's lumpers and splitters. Huxley was like a super lumper, and there's some people who are super splitters, and maybe sort of predictably I'm kind of in the middle. I think that there are some shared subjective qualities that you can find over cultures and regions. We don't know exactly what those are yet, but it seems to be the case, right? When you read these different accounts, there's definitely something shared. But there are all these differences too, and I think it's important to respect those differences as well. So psychedelics can actually help us to answer this question in a really important way, which is cross-cultural research on psychedelics, which is something that we really haven't done very much of yet. But when you administer psychedelics to people from all different cultures all over the world, we can actually quantify how similar the reports are and how different they are. And yeah, I'm guessing that there'll be some similarities and there'll be a whole lot of differences, and it'll be fascinating to see what those are.
Yeah, great question. I'll start by saying that I actually agree with Dr. Yaden on a lot of this particular point, that on the one hand, you've got that extreme of perennialism, on the other hand, the extreme of particularism, and you've got the extreme lumping, the extreme splitting, but it does seem that a participatory model splits the difference. It's hard for me to imagine that, just given especially what we're recognizing from the human connectome, or in other words, the wiring diagram of the human brain, and the fact that every one of us in this room, and every one of you watching us on the internet, has so much more in common in terms of their neural wiring than anything we have that's different. Yeah, it's really easy for us to fixate on those differences and perhaps to even exaggerate them for a variety of social and psychological reasons that we could productively examine. But given how much similarity we have in all of our brains, in all of our nervous systems, it's hard for me to accept a radical particularist approach that there's nothing in common when highly homologous brain structures are consuming highly homologous chemical substances. And I'd say that that's something not just about, cultures in the current moment and the nature of mystical experiences across cultures in the current moment, but across time as well. It's a question of whether we think that there may have been some kind of psychedelic basis for mystery knowledge historically, or for esoteric knowledge historically. And I think that seems to be a possibility, even looking at the historical records. There's some great work that's being done to try to pin down the uses of hallucinogenics and of psychedelics in the origin of spiritual traditions and esoteric traditions. And it does seem apparent that is a relationship that is real. And so then, to me, it becomes an interesting question of the degree to which we ourselves in this contemporary age could tap into some of the same altered states and access some of the same esoteric insights by consuming the same substances. I feel pretty optimistic about that for the reasons that I said about the preservation commonality of the wiring of the human brain, as well as the preservation commonality of these substances themselves across time. But the last thing I'll say for now at this point is that I think that an area that's going to be really exciting and really fruitful is comparative analysis about altered states and insights that are derived from psychedelic use, and altered states and insights that are derived from other types of spiritual practices, whether that's meditation or contemplative prayer or a silent retreat, and the ways in which we'll see convergences and differences in the nature of those altered states and insights, I think is going to illuminate a lot of the question that you're driving at here.
Any question for the...
So I had a question about the quantifiable results part that you said. Is this on?
So I work heavily in oncology, and we follow the, in the UK we follow the NICE guidelines, which are basically something that we use to measure the quality of life of a cancer patient. So we would use an ECOG score or a FACT-G score to do so. And the way we measure the quality of life of a cancer patient is heavily dependent on the patient-reported outcome. So we have, it's like a 27-pointed questionnaire where I am not able to quantify at all if what the patient is saying is in fact actually happening. So if the patient is saying their insomnia is better or their fatigue is less, I don't have a way to check that. I just have to believe what the patient is saying. So if I choose not to believe that, and if I choose not to establish that cause and effect link between the treatment I'm giving and between what the patient is saying that they're experiencing, then essentially there is no way for me to know if what I'm giving is working, right? So do I choose to believe that the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence? Or do I need to believe in the patient's perception of their own understanding of their body and mind? Well, I was just thinking about that when you said if the scientist is going to help the patient know whether the angel is actually existing or not. Are we losing some sort of subjectivity in the concept of spiritualism here, is my question.
Yeah, great question. I love that work, by the way. So, yeah, let's think about this for a second. So if your subject is saying that they have slept, you're saying you have no way of knowing whether they in fact have slept. Now, imagine that it's a sleep study, and you have a camera in the room, and you have one of these wearable thingies, and you have evidence that from multiple streams saying that the subject was reading and then watching TV and walking around and doing some exercise, and throughout the entire night you can see that the subject didn't sleep at all, and yet the self-report is that they had. That happens a lot. There's dissociations between self-report measures and behavioral measures. You want them to align, but sometimes they diverge for all kinds of different reasons. I think in the case of spirituality, like the angel on the head situation, in both cases, I think it's important to trust the self-report. Trust yet verify is something that medical doctors say. So, yeah, in this case, okay, you said that you slept, but when we look at the video, it says you didn't sleep at all, right, in your example. In the spirituality example, someone could say, I saw this spiritual thing. There's no tape that we can go to verify. All we have is that self-report, and I think it's important to trust that, because that's a true experience. The question isn't whether they're having an experience, it's whether their experience is mapping onto something in reality that they think it is. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question. Yeah, so I have a question. Like a lot of people that I interact with
have been saying that like the findings of quantum physics, and like how when you perceive something, then it changes. That like basically that's a proof for like the like non-biological reality being existent. So I want to know like what are your guys like stance on that, and how it does relate to consciousness being real or not, and also like what is your stance on these quantum physics arguments being used by these people trying to speak about spirituality? Like, what do you guys think about that?
No, great question, and that is a maneuver that you hear, even with increasing frequency, is some kind of appeal to so-called spooky dynamics in quantum physics. I would recommend a book by one of your fellow countrymen here, Philip Goff, at the University of Durham, called Galileo's Error, where he takes a deep dive into some of these very types of questions and arguments, and he articulates a heroic defense for a point of view that's called Panpsychism. And Panpsychism has a lot of different types of expressions, but in general, it's the view that consciousness or mind is actually a fundamental aspect of physical reality. It's the view that the material universe has, in some real, non-trivial way, an element of consciousness at its very ground of being. And I'm not prepared at this moment to give a defense of panpsychism, so I will punt a little bit and recommend Philip's treatment of that question. But I will say that it does increasingly seem apparent, if not at the quantum physics level, let's maybe go up a few orders of magnitude to the plant level, it does seem apparent that plants have qualities that we could reasonably identify as intelligent. And it's very interesting to me to think about the way that our attitudes with regard to human planetary relationships would shift if we started to have a more expansive, a more inclusive view of other forms of life that don't necessarily have obvious human forms of intelligence or human forms of consciousness. And the last thing I'll say to this point is I do wonder also when people are having some of these plant medicine-induced experiences of unity and oneness, the degree to which they're having actual insight into the fact that we are necessarily interreliant and connected as a biosphere, and the degree to which our recognition of that union and interreliability is something that will actually be existentially necessary for us as we continue to navigate climate and our relationship with the planet moving forward.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the arguments about quantum physics helping to eliminate consciousness are based on the following argument. Quantum physics seems weird, and we don't know exactly what's going on there. Consciousness seems weird, and we don't know exactly what's going on there. Therefore, maybe quantum physics can explain consciousness, or vice versa. It's kind of like the, in South Park gnomes, it's like socks. What is it? Underpants plus something equals profit. I don't know. I butchered that. But basically, yeah, I don't. Despite the fact that consciousness is unexplained and quantum physics is unexplained, I don't think that provides us with good reason to think that they'll inform one another. I think that like spirituality, the hard problem of consciousness is another issue that we shouldn't pretend is easy. It's a hard problem, and there's nothing in our current scientific understanding that seems like it will allow us to gain traction on that question. Certainly not psychedelics, in my view. Psychedelic science will help us to understand all kinds of things about the contents of consciousness, all kinds of things about mental processes and neurobiological processes. But the nature and origin of consciousness is a deep mystery right now. And I don't think we should be premature at leaping to seeming simplistic explanations of these deep mysteries.
Yes, Kenneth, would you like to?
Hi. I wanted to return to a point that was mentioned at the beginning of the debate, which is this fundamental question of what is spirituality. And I'd like to get some more clarity from you, Michael, on this question. So it seemed like there was quite a bit of substitution of words, right? So spirituality with sacredness, with divinity. There was one point that you made that was quite interesting to me, which is you said that there is an infusion of spirituality into the physical world, that there's an experience of spirituality that is rooted in the body. I would love for you to talk more about that and say how it is that this material universe interacts with spirituality within the context of perhaps a more substantial answer to the question, what is spirituality?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that redirect, Kenneth. And again, I'll draw the analogy with beauty, that at some level, there is an experiential basis that has to be what satisfies us, or has to at least be the platform from which we can now engage in some kind of analytic. And so similarly, the aesthetic of something being sacred has to start with the felt or the lived experience of it. Otherwise, there really is no way that we can create a verbal scaffold that would compel someone to buy into the notion that sacredness is a fact of the universe, or the experience of sacredness is a fact of the universe. I will say that I'm very motivated in large part by this debate to work more closely at that type of verbal analytical scaffold, in addition to continuing to hold that there needs to be an experiential lived connection with the aesthetic of sacredness in order to really understand it. Similarly to the ways that there just has to be some kind of aesthetic experience in order to even engage with philosophy of beauty in a meaningful way. One of the definitions that I've recently been exposed to that I think is very profound is the notion that sacred indicates something that is inexhaustible. A book, for example, can become sacred if you continue to return to it. And each time that you return to it, it reveals something new to you. That there's an inexhaustibility in the depth and in the wisdom of that particular point of reference. This perhaps may be a good excuse for me to come back in another year when I've worked out a more philosophically rigorous defense of sacred and definition of sacred. But for now, I will have to rely a little bit on the generosity of the audience to acknowledge that, okay, there's something experiential that is identified by this genre of vocabulary, and furthermore, that there are practices that are derived from this common genre of experience. Practices that include terms like divinization, deification, theosis, sanctification, the ways in which now this sacrality is no longer just an abstract philosophical construct, but it is something that is embodied, that directs a neuroplastic rearrangement of our own nervous system, and consequently redirects the way that we engage with the world around us.
I think we have time for one more question. I'll go over there if that's all right.
Well, thank you guys very much. Ooh, this is loud. So, my name is Yaden. I'm from the U.S. I'm currently taking positive psychology with Dr. Yawar, Dr. Athar Yawar, who writes on spirituality and medicine. And I've been reading The Emperor's New Drug and Limits to Medicine, if you've heard of those two books. And in Emperor's New Drug, he kind of talks about antidepressants and how we currently understand them at a scientific level. And he's very against how we've gone about analyzing the effects of antidepressants, specifically in terms of the placebo effect. So he looks at like the double-blind, randomized controlled placebo effects, but he says that there's not really a real, even with those studies, there's not a real drug effect occurring. It's actually, the double-blind is not actually real because, because the patients themselves with the antidepressants and the kind of the effects of that, they can tell. So it's actually like an enhanced placebo effect. So my concrete question is, how do we go about studying like psilocybin and depression, keeping in mind the real concern of the placebo effect?
It's a really important issue that you've identified. I mentioned we're in the midst of a psychedelic hype bubble. Part of the reason for that is because we need to do better with our controls, our control groups, in order to control for these expectancy effects or the placebo effect. It's really hard to do, though, in psychedelics. You know, what would be a good control? One way of thinking about it is comparing the current gold standard treatment and seeing if psilocybin is better. But of course, you know what condition you're in, and so there's lots of placebo and expectancy effects there. Another way of doing it is by picking a substance that has effects that are sort of strange in the same way that classic psychedelics are strange. Like you could imagine a high-dose THC versus psilocybin. And in fact, lots of people are thinking about doing that particular study. And there, if you have drug-naive participants, they might say, oh, well, I feel different, I feel strange, I guess, you know, I'm in the active control group. And therefore, you would have the placebo effect kick in both arms and be therefore controlled for. But that remains to be seen whether that will actually be an effective control. But it's a really good point. Yeah, we need to control for expectancy and placebo effects, and it's a difficult methodological problem, but an important one.
So, in addition to agreeing with Dr. Yaden on this, I'll also say that I'm a little bit skeptical about the entire way that the concept of placebo has come to be thought about and talked about. I referenced earlier this book, Sacred Knowledge, and one of the ideas that is very compelling to me in that book, and reflected in other places as well, is the notion that our body has an intrinsic healing intelligence. So much of what needs to happen for us to heal is actually for us to get out of the way of interfering with the healing process. Think trivially about if you break a bone, you put a cast over the area that has a broken bone, specifically so that nothing interferes with the body's own intrinsic healing intelligence. And I do wonder if a lot of times what we're labeling as placebo and trying to control for as some nuisance variable is actually the thing. It's actually the active expression of intrinsic healing intelligence. And so rather than trying to fight with it, can we work to amplify it?
I think we move to closing statements now. Sure.
Okay. I need to write mine.
So first of all, let me again thank everyone who's been involved with this, with our hosts, with our organizers, with you, fantastic audience, and even with you, Dr. Yaden. Let me close by turning to art, which is so wonderful at picking up the slack of analytics, and in particular to the art of one of your fellow countrymen, William Blake. He has this beautiful poem titled The Divine Image. And I hope that perhaps Blake's poetry can fill in some of the gaps that my own intellectual analysis have left on the table here. The divine image. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress. And to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. And all must love the human form, in heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. And you're of course welcome to interpret this through whichever religious or humanist lenses may best suit you or be most comfortable to you. But my parting proposition here is that the intrinsic value of the divine image of our sacred humanity is represented in spiritual traits like forgiveness, compassion, acceptance, and connectedness, and that their value can scarcely be overstated. For a moment, and maybe even for several moments following this evening, I invite you to imagine the transformative power of forgiveness, compassion, acceptance, and connectedness in your own personal world. And while empirical questions about spirituality will continue to abound in psychedelic science during the coming years, I will publicly state my wager that in clinical contexts like major depression, substance use disorders, and psychological trauma, healing outcomes may be causally driven by our development of these spiritual traits. And in that regard, I do see psychedelics having a critical and a vital role.
Well said, Dr. Ferguson. So this was really fun. Thank you to our hosts. Thanks to you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to chatting with people about this fascinating, endlessly, perennially fascinating topic. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The question at hand in this debate: can psychedelic research advance our understanding of the spiritual? I don't think that defining terms is unimportant or pedantic or something that can just be swept away. I think it's really important to do the hard conceptual and theoretical work. And so I think my answer to the question at hand just depends crucially on the meaning of the term spiritual. And again, if we mean people saying something felt spiritual, if we mean people's beliefs about spirituality, if we mean positive, beautiful human traits like compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and love and empathy, connection, then we can study those things. We are studying those things, and psychedelics can help us to study those things at a very profound level. I think that's really important. But if by spirituality we mean something beyond the physical, a mind beyond the brain, a mind beyond the physical universe, then unfortunately we can't look to science to adjudicate those questions. We have to look into your own conscience and your own searching and understanding and seeking and thinking. We can't get around that. And so I would say to avoid being premature, so avoid simplistic solutions. Psychedelic science is interesting enough. We don't need to solve life, the universe, and everything as well. And so I would say, picking up on the theme of humility, which I think is a shared point of agreement, we exist in something that is mostly mystery to us, and I think we can continue to try to understand it while at the same time developing a sense of awe and wonder for that mystery. And so I see psychedelic science as extremely exciting, but worthy of rigor, humility, nuance, and careful statements. And so in conclusion, thank you for having us. And I look forward to chatting with you both.
thank you all for coming. In case you didn't hear at the start, we're going to head to the King's Arms, where Dr. Ferguson and Dr. Yaden will be joining us for kind of drinks and further discussion. And yeah, thank you all for coming.